Good morning, folks. Thank you all so much for coming out to the fifth of our weekly live Q&As in our spring season of Curious Minds, presented by Hollywood Suite. For the next hour or two, we're going to be checking in with our lecturers who will be hosting 20-minute live Q&As in which they'll answer the great questions that you've submitted in response to their Week 5 lectures. We kick things off this morning, as we always do, with the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Mike Daly, who took us this week on a fascinating tour of the folk rock scene of the late 60s and 70s, a topic that elicited lots of really interesting responses and smart questions from all of you, with a particular focus on the always fascinating, always mercurial Mr. Bob Dylan, who's been making some waves recently in the news. So to tackle those questions and more this morning, it's my great pleasure, as always, to hand our virtual stage over to Mike. Please join me in giving him your warmest Curious Minds welcome.
Good morning and welcome to the Q&A. Lots of great questions to hit this morning. Thank you for that. Hope you enjoyed this week's lecture. A fascinating period, that of folk rock, and one with a lot of implications. Though folk rock itself was kind of a brief trend, I think that's deceptive because in a way all rock since then has been folk rock, in that rock and roll gained many of the characteristics that we associate with it today during this period, and of course I talk about that in the lecture. So first question, Di writes, hi Di, are you willing to give us your honest personal opinion of Bob Dylan? I have the impression that you are not exactly impressed by him. Your tone appears to be either tongue-in-cheek or critical in a not overly positive manner. Well, I'll tell you that Bob Dylan is my favorite musician. I love Bob Dylan, and I guess if I appear to be critical, it's because I think about him so much and love his music so much that I don't know how to explain that. I'm critical because I care so much about his music and about his I've thought so much about his career. So I think that Dylan often, maybe it's in a reaction to the idolatry of Dylan, which is so established now, that I think that especially when we look at the period that we're looking at in this lecture, where he is going electric and so on. I mean, he's an anti-hero, right? That's a big part of his persona, and so the fact that he, I guess it could be seen as critical the way I described the way that he threw together a band. I mean, I think that's more of a scandal than him playing an electric guitar at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965, was that he put a basically unrehearsed band up there, had them blast away for a few songs, and you know, he has always followed his own counsel, and that's part of why we idolize him so much, is that he refuses to kowtow to expectations. And so I think that and also I think that he was making a grab for a greater commercial success. I think a lot of the criticisms that were leveled at him, I guess for me, the way that we've looked at Dylan going electric at Newport has become shaded over the years in a way that's unfair to the folkies who booed him. And I think that the perception has been, because rock music kind of won the day in subsequent years in the late 60s and early 70s, we tend to look at the people who booed as being these sort of stuffy, party pooper, dogmatic. And, you know, a lot of the booing was not just because people didn't like an electric guitar. I feel that that really shortchanges the critique of Dylan in the wake of that incident, because I think it was much more that Dylan was trying to appeal to the teeny boppers, to the Beatles fans, that he was making a grab for commercial success. Now, it wasn't quite as simple as that, but I think that part of it is true, that he was actually, you know, he wanted some of that rock and roll money, and I think that's I think we can say that, and I don't think it takes away anything from, you know, just as Leonard Cohen, you know, he said many times, Leonard Cohen, why did he start being a singer-songwriter and not just a poet and a novelist? Well, there's no money in being a poet, especially a Canadian poet. So, you know, it doesn't take away from his artistry and what he achieved. They achieved. But so, I'm sorry if I put across too negative, or if it seemed unbalanced, maybe because in the background in my mind is my admiration for Dylan. And of course, I have to mention that Dylan's new album came out today, and I was listening to it this morning. I wasn't able to listen to all of it. It's actually a 2-disc album, but I was listening to it on Spotify, and it's pretty wonderful. It's his first album of original material since 2012, and it does not disappoint. And it's called Rough and Rowdy Ways, and he's still got it. I mean, he's really, it's exciting. So I'm all in a tizzy, and I have to say, Bob Dylan's new album and Neil Young issuing his long-lost 1975 album Homegrown, all taking place on Father's Day weekend. Major dad energy going on right now. Okay, Phil writes, the singer-songwriter ballads of the 70s, as they address their personal experiences of love, unrequited love, and physical deterioration, sometimes using sophisticated poetry, appear to be still within the folk song tradition. In your opinion, can any of the singer-songwriters of today still find a place within the folk song fabric? I think, I posted a question on my Facebook asking people who are the great, or who are the best folk singers, Canadian folk singers of today. I wanted to know what some of my friends thought, and the answers that I got really ran the gamut of really pushing, to me, the boundaries of what I would consider folk music, but it really impressed upon me how unstable a category folk music is today. I kept remembering, as I looked at all of these singer-songwriters that people were posting, and that's pretty much nobody posted a traditional person. There were no child ballad interpreters on the list. It was all singer-songwriters who might play an acoustic guitar. And that none of these people, according to the Harvard Dictionary of Music, is a folk singer, because they are professionals. They are not working within an oral tradition. They are commercial musicians, professional commercial musicians who are writing songs very much in the popular song tradition, but they are influenced by traditional folk music. And so I think that the singer-songwriters are not folk musicians. However, the folk revival, one of the things that the folk revival did was it really, it perverted the term folk music. And so it's, even Pete Seeger admitted that he's not a folk musician. He is an interpreter of folk music. He is a booster of folk music. He is a performer of folk songs, but that does not make him a folk musician. Pete Seeger was a, Harvard educated, musically trained, professional musician. And, even though he was a great exponent of traditional songs, he does not fit in to the classic definition of folk music. Anyway, I don't want to belabor the point too much, but I say, do the modern singer-songwriters fit in the folk tradition? Sure, but in a way, none of them do. And Bob Dylan doesn't. Joan Baez doesn't. Peter, Paul, and Mary don't. None of them do. None of them are really folk singers, but the definition folk widened in a way that made it, in my opinion, basically so unstable as to be useless in the 1950s and 1960s. But again, what's in a name? It really doesn't matter. So if people want to call themselves folk music, and I'm reminded of the phrase often attributed to Louis Armstrong, I figure all folk songs, paraphrasing here, I figure all songs are folk songs. I never heard a horse sing them, so let's go with that. Tyler writes, did Bob Dylan receive any formal voice or guitar training, or was he entirely self-taught? Well, nobody is entirely self-taught. He certainly learned things. He picked up things along the way by listening to records and emulating them, by picking up tips from other musicians face to face, watching them on stage. He did not have any formal music lessons. However, and I find this something that's kind of odd, and I've never had this answered. I've read that when he was at the University of Minnesota for his brief university career, he was a music major. And when I went to school, you had to be able to read music to be a music major. So what gives with that? Either that description is inaccurate, and I for one would love to see his university transcripts and know what courses he took, but that's just me. So maybe there's something going on here that I don't know, but from everything I've heard, he is entirely not formally trained, and not self-taught, but yeah, he never had a teacher, guitar teacher, or he had painting teachers, art teachers over the years, but he didn't have singing teachers or guitar teachers. And could you comment more broadly on the extent to which the musical icons we've been studying in this series received formal musical training or were self-taught? How many of them could read and notate music? Well, Pete Seeger was musically trained. His father was a music professor, and so he could read music and write musical notation. Some of them, like Sis Cunningham, who co-founded Broadside magazine, she could, quite a few of the early folk song scholars could read music, and it was necessary in those days because they were publishing songbooks and they needed to write down the music to be published. And so quite a few of them, I would say the later musicians were not music readers for the most part. There's been a general decline in music literacy, I think to our detriment today, but so it was much more commonplace for musicians of all stripes who were coming up in the 30s and 40s to read and notate music. Stu writes, it's amazing to think of how many iconic musicians played an important role in the folk rock period you discussed in this week's lecture. Giants like Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan. Given their huge influence on the course of popular music in the 20th century, do you think of the folk rock movement as its own self-contained short-term fad, or has the celebrity and success of these artists made this a much more enduring musical genre? Yes. And as I argue in the lecture, when rock absorbed the authenticity, the interest in poetic lyrics, the social consciousness, rock and roll already had folk-like qualities, seeing as it was derived from styles like country and western, blues, these sort of grassroots styles. Rock and roll already had a folk quality to it, and so it absorbed sort of folk revival qualities, and so I think it never shed those things. That's not to say that all rock music or all rock and roll music has those folk qualities. I would argue that You know, there are certain there's certain rock that has less of these qualities and is more of a continuation of 1950s rock and roll. But I think, yeah, I think it was permanent. The folk rock itself as a name of a style and as a kind of narrow style that I really concentrated on by talking about the Mamas and the Papas and Sonny and Cher and, you know, this you know, Sounds of Silence. That was kind of short-lived, but the fusion of folk with rock is with us to this day. Brian writes, starting in the late 70s, my understanding of folk music was transformed by experiences like the Vancouver Folk Music Festival, where I was exposed to lots of broader world music that introduced a mind-blowing variety of sounds into my listening habits. I imagine that Winnipeg, Mariposa, WOMAD, and other festivals did the same thing for others. It was a kind of awakening for many of us, making us less ethnocentric and perhaps even more political. Vancouver always had a strong political ethos. What's your take on the impact of world music on the evolution of folk music here? Thank you, Brian. Well, folk music has always had a wider world view. If you look even at what the Weavers and Pete Seeger were doing, that they were taking songs from all over the world and adapting them, you know, Israeli songs, African songs, taking them, singing them in their original languages in many cases, and trying to present as a way of better understanding the world these songs. I found that especially in the early Yorkville coffee house scene, there was a real premium on songs in different languages, and the more languages that you could sing, kind of you were held in a higher esteem. We often see in articles about these early singers, you know, he sings in 8 languages, they sing in 13 languages. Malka and Yoso being a perfect example of singing in all these different languages. What we begin to see, though, in the 80s and 90s is what you're talking about, where we are actually hearing artists from these non-Western lands. And that has to do with a couple of forces. And one is globalization of the record industry, where we see emanating out from the United States that the commercial pop music industry begins to put its tendrils out all into these places, and there are branch offices of record companies, and we begin to see these homegrown record industries in these places that can nurture homegrown or you know, indigenous musical styles. Now, very often, because of globalization of American pop music, they are influenced by American pop music, and they fuse the sounds of American pop music with indigenous styles. That makes their music more palatable to a Western audience, and so we begin to see this kind of crossover happening, where these records are beginning to be imported into North America. They start to gather attention. We start bringing those groups in. Many of them are doing a world music fusion, that is combining the sound of Western pop music and Western folk music with their own country. And so there's a big surge of popularity. I mean, that's a big subject I don't have time to go into. But I think that it had to do with the globalization, in short, and the globalization of the commercial music industry. And before I finish, I just want to mention that I'm about to launch a new course. If you go to my website, MikeDalyMusic.com, it's launching on Monday, called The 1960s in 60 Songs. So quick plug in there, go to MikeDalyMusic.com. And I think that's all the time I have. Is that true, Will?
It is indeed, but thank you for those wonderful and incredibly impactful but concise responses to the good questions we had this week. I want to mention just a couple important programming updates for all the folks at home. first, an immediate short-term one, which is that for any of you who are attending our Meals That Change the World series with Laura Carlson, a reminder that there is no live Q&A this morning at 11:30. We had to reschedule due to a family issue that Laura is dealing with, but we'll be following up with you over email with responses to her questions. And then the other big programming update, Mike, that we have to share with our friends at home is that we are going to be launching our very first summer edition of Curious Minds next Thursday, launching 2 new courses for registration. And one of those is an incredibly exciting series on Neil Young, led by the one and only Dr. Mike Daly. That's right. So more Mike Daly coming your way, folks, very soon. I'll have a little more information for you in my intro to the 6th lecture in this series that we'll be launching on Monday. And we'll have more information for you, obviously, in the weeks to come. But mark your calendars for next Thursday to sign up for the next edition of Curious Minds, including a very, very exciting series on Neil Young, led by the one and only Mike. So, Mike, we're heading into Father's Day weekend. As you said, lots of big dad energy in the air right now. We're also heading into the grand finale of this series next week. You're looking at some of the amazing contemporary musicians who are keeping the folk flame alive. Give us a little preview.
Well, I'm going to try to summarize the ways I'm trying to look at the lasting impact, especially of the folk revival today. So in terms of updating us on what we have as far as folk infrastructure, things like the festival circuit, venues, especially the house concert trend of recent years, and how that has given new life to folk-based touring musicians, and also highlighting some of the contemporary folk musicians that I think are interesting, especially American and Canadian ones, and things like the old time music revival, and just some interesting recent developments, and then finally talking about the ways that music is being used for protest and for as a way of motivating the crowd in the recent Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and some of the innovative ways that technology is being brought into play in a way that I think very much relates to what we've been talking about with the uses of folk music for protest.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's an incredibly timely and topical lecture, and a great finale to what's been a really exciting historical journey we've taken. Mike, as always, it's a real pleasure to connect with you on Friday mornings. Have a wonderful Father's Day weekend, and we look forward to hearing more from you next week.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, talk soon.